So yeah, I found out about you through Tailwind, and I'm trying to remember where I found out about Tailwind. I guess it was because of tachyons.
Yeah.
So we started doing functional CSS from tachyons, and we got into that from a guy that we worked with at TED.
Yeah. We pretty quickly ran into a problem of not being able to customize.
Yeah.
And that's I think that's what led us to Tailwind.
Cool.
So is that, were some of the pain points in like the other functional CSS libraries the main motivation for creating Tailwind?
They weren't actually, like they were in some ways, but Tailwind actually kind of started from the other direction. So Tailwind initially was before I had a name or anything, was a set of styles that I had been porting around from project to project, just a bunch of less files basically, where I kind of tried to put together my own little framework to basically replace Bootstrap for my own stuff, because Bootstrap switched to Sass and I completely can't stand Sass. I really hate Sass. So that was like the nail in the coffin for using Bootstrap for me, because I wanted to keep using Less, because there's features that Less has that Sass doesn't have that were really important to the way that I work, which eventually became features that we baked into Tailwind as custom post-CSS stuff.
Interesting.
And the main feature that I liked about Less is that you could use classes as mixins in Less. So in Sass, if you want to create a mixin that you can mix into other styles, you have to declare it explicitly as a mixin. Whereas in Less, I could create a utility class and I could mix in that utility class into other classes.
I see.
And Less just supported it because it didn't differentiate between, there's parameterized and non-parameterized mixins.
I see.
And a class doubles as kind of both.
So where in Sass you can only extend.
Well, you can create mixins in Sass too, but you have to do the add mixin, define it, then add include to pull it in. So the equivalent code in Sass to what I was doing in Less is I would have to say, like, say I was making a mixin for like text center or something. I have to do at mixin text center, text align center. Then I would have to make like say I had a button component and I wanted the text to be centered in that. I would have to go add include text center in the button.
Right.
Then if I wanted to have a text center utility as well, I have to create a .text center class that did add include text center. So it's like 3 style declarations instead of 2.
Whereas in Less,
I would just say the button, and I would just say .text center inside the button.
And then the .text center would have the text align center.
Yeah, exactly.
I see. Oh, cool.
So that was like the thing that really I couldn't stand about Sass. And what's interesting about it is that it's the same, that workflow is like the same workflow that like we encourage with Tailwind, where you're starting with utilities and creating components out of utility classes.
When it makes sense.
Yeah. So anyways, Tailwind started as just this Less framework that was very similar to Bootstrap in a lot of ways. You know, it started off with not that many utilities, just mostly padding and margin stuff and text alignment and stuff.
That's we talk about that as like the gateway drug into functional CSS.
Yeah,
It's like the utility. It's like the alignment and padding margin.
Yeah, when you convince yourself that like it's allowable to have a margin left, whatever class, it solves so many annoying CSS problems, because I think the thing that component-based CSS is really terrible at is styling the stuff in between components, right? Like the space between components and stuff like that. And that sounds like, okay, well, I'm only going to have that happen so many times. There's components on the page. I put things, space and margin between them. Okay, sure. But what ends up really happening is that as you try and create more and more reusable components, you end up with things that maybe you would have made a component class before that end up being actually just like 3 smaller component classes combined, like a card that has a form and a button in it instead of like a button form card.
Right.
You know what I mean? Right? It's like more composable.
Yep.
And when you start doing things that way, well, then you start using these little utilities in more and more places to kind of define the relationship between like the different pieces. So that's kind of like what utilities and stuff it had at the beginning. And it still had like button classes and list groups and like a lot of Bootstrap inspired stuff. But as I started like trying to carry these styles around from project to project by literally copying and pasting files, I just started like paying attention to like what styles were surviving that journey. And most of the time,
the list group.
didn't survive. Like that's not useful in this project,
Yep.
or that looks different in this project. But what is the stuff that never changes from project to project? And it was always just the utility stuff. So over time, it started to just have more and more utilities in it. And I started working with a friend of mine, Jonathan Rennick, because I talked to him about the way that I've been doing CSS, where I was starting to do things like a lot more utility focused. And this was before I even had actually used tachyons or even seen it. And he started playing with, he wanted to use the styles that I had in his project, which was totally different than my stuff. And this was like a good way for us to kind of figure out, okay, so how can we make something that both of us can use?
So it seemed like this development was going alongside in time-wise to things like tachyons becoming more popular.
Yeah.
But it was just naturally the way your project and your workflows evolved.
Yeah, I just kind of my style had been evolving from like component-based CSS to like more utility-focused CSS. As I tried to make my stuff more and more reusable and remove duplication and get rid of annoying named things that I hated the names for, you know what I mean?
Right.
It's always cool when you see like, multiple people developing the same thing on their own.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
usually a sign.
A really
that,
good
like,
sign.
Something good is
Yeah.
here.
So even like the first version of Tailwind that me and Jonathan kind of, when we started like almost getting the documentation ready and stuff, or at least started thinking about it and trying to decide everything that should be included, at the time that it still had button classes and stuff like that. He kind of convinced me to get rid of them because he wasn't using them on his project because my buttons, and I was.
You were like, it has to have a button
like,
class.
You gotta have buttons. Like people need buttons.
Yeah.
But he eventually convinced me that there's no way for us to there's no abstraction we can provide higher than this level that is still useful for every single project. You know what I mean?
Was there like a aha moment where you're like, it's all utility, no more of this?
I don't know. I don't think so, really, because there are still a couple of styles in the framework that are not single CSS properties. I can only think of two, but
What are? I'm just curious.
so there's a truncate utility, which sets like overflow hidden, white space no wrap, and text overflow ellipsis. That's the biggest one, and then there's like a list reset that sets list style type none and padding 0.
Right.
Those are the only two styles that set multiple properties, I think.
But that's so cool. I mean, it's like, what are we going to ship that no one feels pressured to overwrite? Because that's the thing. If you ship a framework and it has a .button class, and then someone's overriding it, it's like you've lost. Like you're,
Totally. I think like that's the one thing that I can say is a truth about CSS that I learned over time is like undoing styles is a big time anti-pattern in CSS. Like if you have to undo styles, like that's
you're approaching it the wrong way.
Yeah, it's much better to be adding styles, layering styles. If you have to try and undo something that's already there, that's
you're just setting yourself up for future pain.
Things are going to be bad.
Did you feel like you were going against the dogma or the status quo? Like, did that bother you? Like, did you feel like I'm not writing Semantics CSS or I'm not writing classes the way I was taught 10 years ago or whatever it is?
I think like there's one article I read that kind of completely changed my mind on that, which was called, I think it's called About HTML Semantics and Front-End Architecture by Nicholas Gallagher, who used to work at Twitter. I don't know what he does now, but he's also the guy who created Normalized CSS. And he kind of talks about like basically the idea that coupling CSS classes to content makes them impossible to reuse. And conceptually, there's basically no difference between a class like card and a class like, he doesn't use these exact words, but this is kind of like what the eureka moment for me was reading this article. There's not really any difference between a card class and like a text red class. They're both named after the appearance that they apply to the thing that they're being added to. It's just card for some reason feels like easier to
structural
accept,
or
right?
Yeah, it's like higher levels.
But it's not semantic in any way. Like I'm giving this a class of card because I want it to look like a card,
right?
Not because it is a card,
right?
You know what I mean? So when I kind of like realized that, I thought about it a lot for a long time, and I eventually kind of realized that people always talk about like separation of concerns in CSS and HTML, where HTML is about the content, CSS is about the presentation, and the CS or the HTML shouldn't contain any presentational information. But that's not how it actually ends up being in practice. Like that actually is not true. Like that's not how you should think about HTML and CSS. Because,
theory versus reality.
Well, if you separate the quote unquote concerns, you have HTML that's about content, you have CSS that's about styling, but that's not what your CSS is actually. If you look at the CSS, it's full of stuff about content too, because now you have a class called
modal header,
user profile or something, or you have a class called like stuff related to the domain of what you're building. You know what I mean? Like it's leaking information about the content into your CSS. So it's not that the CSS is just about styling and the HTML is just about content. It's that the CSS is tightly coupled to the HTML. Like HTML is written to be styled by anything. It chooses the class names, right? HTML dictates the names of the classes, and then you write a style sheet that hooks into that HTML and styles it. But that style sheet is written for that document and no other document. So there's a very tight coupling still.
Interesting. You couldn't reuse the style sheet for any other piece of any other template
project,
any other.
No. Whereas the other way that you can do it, which is what people traditionally call, quote unquote, mixing concerns, is actually just flipping that dependency. You're writing CSS that is completely oblivious of the content that it's styling, and then you're writing HTML that is consuming that CSS. So I think separation of concerns isn't even a valid thing. It doesn't even make any sense. It's really just about your HTML depends on your CSS, or your CSS depends on your HTML. And things can get messy, in my opinion, when you start blurring that line too much and don't kind of pick a camp that like you want to be in. So there's always going to be exceptions. Like you're still going to have to write specific CSS for a project.
Right.
A lot of time for certain highly specific situations, but for the most part, I've found that the best development experience for me has always been if I try to write my CSS as if it's a third-party library that I'm downloading from someone who doesn't know that I'm using it to make a dog biscuit store or something. You know what I mean?
That's so interesting. We've been kind of on this journey for a while, but thinking about it in terms of the direction of the dependency, because that's how we think about code a lot.
Yeah.
It reminds me, like Sandy Metz talks a lot about this in the Ruby community, about things that depend on things that change less often than them, and that's you want that dependency to flow through your system, because the things that change more often depend on things that change less often, which makes things that change more often easier to refactor.
And the other thing too is like how many times, how rare is it that you have to change how something looks and you were ever able to do it in just the CSS? Like it was always changing HTML and changing CSS to change how something looked. Like to me, that's the smell. That's the sign that you actually are mixing concerns.
Right.
Because now you're trying to make one change, but you have to change something in two places.
Right.
Whereas if you take a functional approach, or at least an approach where you're applying classes to your HTML that are defined in CSS, instead of like inventing classes in your HTML and hooking into them from CSS, when you want to change how something looks, now you just edit the HTML. You know? So
I think that was a big argument from Adam from Tachyons. Morris is the last name, I believe.
Morse,
yeah. And he made that in his article at that point where he's like, you're always, if you do it, there's one way you have to change both HTML and CSS to change anything. But if you do it my way, you can add new features or change the UI with just changing the HTML, and that's really powerful.
And it's hard to get people past that like sort of dogma. They've been brainwashed to feel like you're not allowed to have presentational stuff in your HTML, but I think it makes it easier when you make people realize that half the class names they're already using have already made that decision to be presentational.
Right. They're tied to the specific presentation of the app.
Yeah, and it's not even about like the names of the classes or anything like that. It's about how you're thinking when you write the HTML. Like if you ever, when writing HTML, pick a class that already exists and put it on your HTML, like you're already choosing that direction of dependencies where the CSS is independent and the HTML depends on it. Like even if the CSS class is not named in like in a way that seems obviously presentational, if the CSS dictates the class name instead of me writing div class equals, what should I call this div so I can go write some CSS for it later? Like it's a mental model difference, you know what I mean?
Right.
And if you've chosen to say div class equals, what's the class again
that makes this look like that? Right.
That you're firmly in the presentational CSS camp already.
Regardless of the name of the class.
You might not even know it.
That's so interesting. So that's how you get them.
Yeah.
And then you say, all right, just take it to its logical conclusion.
Yeah.
And be honest about what you're doing.
Yeah.
And you'll have a much better time.
Way better time. Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
That's a really cool way to think about it. Whenever we talk about, so we did a training on Tailwind actually.
Yeah.
At EmberConf. And it's the same thing every time we've talked about this over the last year or two. Just the initial reaction. It's how people thought about like JSX. It's just like, regardless of where you think about JSX after using it for a year, your initial reaction is like, you know.
Totally.
So it's the same thing with this stuff.
Yeah.
There's a barrier to overcome.
Yeah.
So I feel like the argument you just laid out, I find very compelling. I think a lot of people, if they heard that, could be compelled by it. But then you sit down to use it and you're like, oh, there's like, you either choose for your CSS to depend on HTML or HTML to depend on CSS. There's no difference. You're probably already doing that, so let's just be honest and go for it. And then you like look at the thing and you're like, wow, my template really does depend on my CSS, and it looks crazy because it has all these general purpose utilities everywhere.
Yeah.
So just wondering, like, if you've had any ideas for how to teach that or how people overcome it, or just
I think it's one of those things where you have to just try it, because I feel the exact same way as anyone else who looks at it. Like, you get used to seeing all those classes and they don't bother you anymore, but the visceral reaction you get, like, wow, I'm applying 9 classes to something to style it. Like, why am I doing this? Like, this is going to be unmaintainable, blah, 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 blah. Like, you have all these kind of fears about it. And a lot of it isn't even that. A lot of it is completely irrational, right? A lot of it is just like, this like looks like a mess, so it must be a mess. But the interesting thing is that just because it looks like a mess, it doesn't mean that it actually is a mess.
Right.
Because...
Well, you're reusing way more classes than you ever were in any other app. And you can change this part of your app and not break the rest of your app.
Yeah.
And you're using a very minimal subset of CSS that can help guarantee your design language feels consistent throughout the application.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's interesting because like applying an HTML class is a local thing, but changing CSS is global, right? So if you try to change how something looks with CSS, that has global implications, but changing the classes in the class attribute can't affect anything else.
That's another that's a great
little tidbit.
That's a great little tidbit, yeah.
But the problem, when you try to ask someone like, okay, so it looks messy, how do you rationalize like your fear of it being messy? Like, what are you actually afraid of? Like, what is the mess signaling in your brain that's making you think this is a bad idea? A lot of it is like, well, it's going to be like unmaintainable. What if I have to change everything that uses these classes all at the same time? How do I change the color of all these buttons? Or how do I change, whatever? So with Tailwind, this is different than a lot of other functional CSS tools that are a lot more, I don't know what the right word is, but basically a lot more opinionated about the fact that like this CSS classes should be single properties. That's it. I know Tachyons takes this stance like pretty aggressively. And with Tailwind, it's like we get it. Like sometimes you need a button class, but the way that we kind of encourage people to work with it is to extract these sorts of classes as the duplication actually becomes clear that it's duplication, first of all, and when it becomes actually painful. So if you're creating a button and it has classes like inline block, BG blue, text white, font bold, PX4, PY2, rounded, hover BG blue dark, that's maybe like all the classes for your button.
Mm-hmm.
If you have 4 buttons that all have those styles applied to them, well, if you can ask yourself and say, well, if I change the back, or if I change the font weight of this button, do I want the other, am I going to be wanting to change the font weight of all the other buttons too? Well, and if the answer is yes, okay, you have real duplication.
Right.
So the solution to that with Tailwind typically is you create what we call component classes, and you make a class like button or button blue or something. And to make the class actually work, you just have to copy and paste the list of classes out of that element and write add apply inside of your component tag and paste the list of classes in. And this button class will now spring into existence as basically a class composed of all those utilities as mixins. So the styles for all those classes gets basically pasted into the button class.
Right.
And now you can change all of them at the same time. And now, like, that's only one solution to that problem, though. Like, and what they'll recommend in a lot of other functional CSS tools is basically that, like, most of the time, that sort of duplication is like more of a templating problem than it is a CSS problem. Especially with tools like if you're using React or any other JavaScript framework that's component driven, you probably have like a primary button component.
Right.
So that list of classes only exists in that file anyways,
right.
even though it's 9 classes long.
That's been exactly our experience.
That's how we teach it. It's
you
have a thing here. It's time to give it a name. You're naming the component.
Yeah.
That's where it goes.
Yeah. And I think that works. I think that's the right way for application development, especially single page application or building JavaScript applications where everything is done that way. The thing that bugs me about like using that as like the prescriptive approach to solving that is it's like ignoring the fact that there's millions of developers building WordPress templates and stuff where telling them, oh, create a template partial for every single part of the thing is just like, I guess, but like that's just not how we build these sorts of things.
You're throwing away a lot of knowledge.
You're just trying to get people to change too many things about the way they work at one time.
That really hits home. I was working on a Rails app a couple of years ago, and I had already bought into functional CSS, and I was duplicating, long classes that should have been named, or I was creating partials. And
the partials felt heavy.
The partials felt heavy. It's not a normal Rails workflow to. Oh, you're making a button. Go create a partial.
Right.
Like that's
it's coming from
it's
the
already
expert.
a tag. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, usually, you're only creating partials in like these server rendered template languages when you have like multiple HTML elements with like some options maybe or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
You're trying to save yourself this like repetitive typing, but it's very rare that you have a partial for like a heading. Or partial for a button, or a link even, you know what I mean?
Yep.
So
that's really good to hear that like Tailwind is meeting developers where they're at.
Yeah. And
awesome.
I build server rendered apps for the most part, right? I use some Vue.js or React on the front end, but I'm not typically building like an SPA and a
JSON
API, right? So I'm still doing a lot of templating stuff in server side template languages where I still want to follow the conventions that I'm used to and the people that I'm going to be working with are used to, and not just unnecessarily introduce tons and tons of partials where I could solve that problem with just like 6 component classes in the application for like form inputs or selects or whatever.
I was going to ask, you're working on a server rendered app, and maybe after a few months, do you end up kind of creating your own like UI library with a bunch of the component? What do you call them?
Component classes.
Component classes.
Not usually. So something that's kind of interesting about the whole workflow we try to encourage with Tailwind, which is only to extract components as they prove necessary, is that most of the time they don't prove themselves necessary. So if you think about some of the stuff that exists in like a more commonly used CSS framework like Bootstrap, for example, you have classes for like a navbar component or something. But how many nav bars do you have in an app? Like, I've never built an app where I had to duplicate the navbar markup ever. It's like a master layout file has one navbar in it. I only write it once.
And if you change it, why do you want to go through the indirection of seeing the navbar class on the HTML and then going to the style definition if you could just change it?
And with those sorts of like responsive navbars where you have to be very crafty about where all the HTML is positioned and stuff, if you want to change how that thing looks, like I can basically promise you you're making changes to the HTML already anyways. But in that sort of situation, you have a navbar, it's got 11 billion utility classes composing the whole thing. Maybe you extract it to a partial anyways, just for the sake of like
sanity.
Yeah. And it just doesn't matter that all those utility classes are there. Like there's literally no problems that you're facing because of it, other than maybe it hurts your eyes to look at the template. You know what I mean? But
what about when you're working on a bigger application that's maybe not like a one-off project where you just, you're banging out some HTML and CSS with the utility classes, maybe you do a button or two into a component class. Yeah. What about a project that's going to go on for a year or 2 or 3, multiple people are going to work on it, and you want them to, when they build new pages, you want it to adhere. So maybe you do end up with things like, a nav, a pill nav,
sure,
or a toggle, like an accordion.
Yeah, you can totally create component classes for that sort of thing, and there's multiple ways to do that with Tailwind. So for the longest time, the recommended approach was basically to do that in your CSS, right? Because with Tailwind, the way it generally works is you have a CSS file, you drop in these 3 Tailwind directives, we call them, but they're really just these custom @ rules. So you have pre-flight, which is Tailwind's base reset styles. There's @Tailwind components, which is where we drop just our container class right now. That's the only component that ships with Tailwind. And then there's @Tailwind utilities. And the reason that these come in 3 separate parts is because the order of declarations in CSS is crazy important. Mm-hmm. So if you want to add your own components, you want to make sure you do that before the utilities. And if you want to add your own utilities, you want to make sure that comes after Tailwind's utilities, for example.
So that you can override things in a way you would expect?
Not even necessarily over. Yeah. So if I make a custom component for buttons, I want to know that if I just throw a BG red class on that's going to work,
right,
because I expect it to work. So if I can define that after the component,
right,
as long as the specificity is the same, then whatever's last in the CSS file wins, right?
And this is why when you were saying you're kind of getting in a bad situation when you are overriding CSS, and this is a good way to try to help prevent it. But even still, you're opening yourself up to specificity, the cascade, which is can make your life hard.
Yeah, so if you wanted to write these custom component classes like buttons or pill navs or whatever, typically what we recommend is just write CSS like you used to. And there's a bunch of features of Tailwind that can make it easier to be consistent with your design system, right? So we have @apply, which lets you mix in utility classes. And typically, when I'm creating components, I'm very rarely writing CSS property declarations. It's always just using utility classes, but sometimes you do have to do a new box shadow or something one-off, which is fine. So that's one way that you can do this stuff, is just by editing your CSS file and adding that stuff. Something that I think is another interesting approach that has been possible since Tailwind 0.5, which came out earlier this year, maybe February I think, is Tailwind has a plugin system now. So if you're building, say, a component library that you want to be reused across multiple internal projects, say, Tailwind has a way that you can basically add, register new styles with Tailwind for it to generate in JavaScript instead of in CSS, which is nice because you can just require those as modules. You can publish them to NPM, and people can just do NPM install Tailwind CSS buttons, and now they have them in their project. So that's another way you can do it. And the thing that's cool about that is you have all the power of JavaScript too. So
color scales or anything like that,
or building column classes by using EmberMap to generate classes. You know what I mean? Instead of using some crazy Sass for each stuff, or trying to write code in a language that's not meant to be a programming language, being kind of restricted by those features, when you could just use a real programming language and just create these objects that represent CSS rules, and then just register those with Tailwind. So.
Nice. It's really cool that Tailwind was extracted from your workflow. I mean, I think my favorite projects are ones that are extracted from real people's workflow. And I think it shows in the design the pragmatism of it, and how it accommodates many kinds of workflows.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably one of the things that has made it be so successful so far, even though it's a very young project.
Yeah.
So that's great. I have a few ideas about the ugliness of the class stuff,
Mm-hmm.
How I was thinking, because we use it for teaching, and we'll make a little demo, and it's great. Tailwind classes will get you there super quick. But one of the things we were talking about in one of the podcast episodes is just, if you're looking at something like an Ember template or a Vue template, you really have two things going on. You have the styling stuff, or at least your frame of mind is usually one of two places, which is I'm trying to style this, or I'm trying to wire up functionality.
Yeah, totally.
And it's kind of interesting that those are different things, but it doesn't, to really separate them completely wouldn't feel right.
Yeah.
Because of the coupling that you described earlier.
Yeah.
Like, they are coupled, but there is a lot of visual noise from the classes.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, even if it was something as simple as like collapsing the class attribute in the HTML, so that if I'm working on the code, if my cursor's not on an element, I just see the control flow, I see the action wiring, I see the variables, and I'm explaining that stuff. That's good. Now it's time to style it. I could expand all class attributes everywhere, and we could just focus on the stuff. Something like that.
Yeah.
It's like you think about Sketch, and you look at a complex thing, and the layers and the names are all hidden away. You can just focus on the thing and reach in and grab it. But the fact that our templates have all of this, all the pieces there, can sometimes make it hard to visually parse everything. So maybe
even just a way to like take that to a further level where it's almost like hide all native HTML attributes
and
period.
just see,
like I don't even want to see IDs or data attributes or any of that stuff. Only like the stuff that the JavaScript section actually cares about or hooks into.
But
at the same time, sometimes you are doing like dynamic class registration and stuff like that, so it can be
maybe like click handler, like event handlers and variables or something, and then you can just get your test passing or whatever. So you do PHP, you do Laravel, and then you also do Vue, but you said you're not doing like complete Vue applications, at least mainly. One of the things I think we were talking about in the Tailwind Slack at one point was, we do Ember mostly, just Ember on the front end. And so thinking how the functional stuff made its way into our workflow, that's where some of the ideas of like using components to toggle functional classes at like a more abstract level, like making a button component instead of like a component class. But you said something where you were like, I think if I was doing a full Vue application, I wouldn't even use Tailwind. So talk about that.
I think so a lot of the CSS and JS stuff that's kind of getting a lot of attention lately, to me, is quite interesting. And the one that most interests me is Emotion, which is the PayPal CSS and JS library. And I think there's like another one that someone told me works like the same way. That is cool too. But I'm not super interested in like style components, for example, because the thing I don't know enough about it, but the thing that doesn't appeal to me, I guess, or at least the decision that it makes that doesn't excite me, like some of these other tools make, is it uses like these what do you call them, like template literals or whatever.
Template strings,
like
the backticks.
Yeah, it's the backticks, but it's like the function called backtick thing and you still write your CSS in styled components as like it feels like you're still writing strings. You know what I mean? So you're still just writing styles, like however. I'm just typing whatever values I want. Sure, I could probably like do like $, whatever, to put variables in. So I could say padding is, and then like interpolate some value or something like that. So whatever.
It's possible, but it's not really encouraged.
It doesn't really feel like
the default.
Yeah, I guess.
Or is it not constrained enough?
Well, what I really want to get at is that when I was looking at Emotion, they have the ability to do it like with the template literal stuff the way Style Components does, but they also have object styles, which is a JavaScript object with properties and values. And the thing that was interesting to me about that was like, well, I can make objects any way I want. You know what I mean? I don't have to, like, so the way Emotion works in general is you do like, they give you this function called CSS, and you pass in an object literal, and that defines all the styles. And that object literal, or that CSS function, returns a class name, because that's the class name that's going to have those styles attached to it. You don't know what the class name is, right? It returns like some hash generated whatever thing. It doesn't matter. But then you just put that class name on the element where you wanted those styles to be applied. So that doesn't sound that interesting on its own. But what is interesting to me about it is like there's a million ways to build that object.
Right. So now you have an opportunity. That's a low-level thing, but you can create higher-level abstractions that are constrained.
So if I was going to write something that was a full view app, and I was going to use like a CSS and JS approach, for example, instead of using Tailwind's classes, it's interesting to me because it kind of removes that whole regular CSS like part of my application. Like that just goes away now. I don't have to worry about any of that at all. And I just write. I can basically do exactly what I do with Tailwind, where I'm trying to style things in line. Tailwind is like a solution to its problem, where the problem is I just want to write inline styles.
Yeah.
But I want to write inline styles with a set of constraints to make it easy for me to be consistent. Right. And I also want to be able to do hover styles and media queries and stuff like that you can't do in inline styles. But with Emotion and CSS and JS, you can do all that stuff.
Interesting.
And particularly with the object style stuff, I could totally write a Tailwind CSS and JS library that was a layer on top of Emotion, where I could basically write the same stuff I write inside that class attribute, but it generates the classes on the fly. And it removes this class of problems we deal with in Tailwind, which is there's a lot of CSS that exists that you're never going to use.
Yeah.
Right? And we get around that we have a lot of different ways that you can try and keep that minimal, right? Like you can turn off modules you're not using. You can not generate responsive versions of the cursor class if you're not responsively changing the cursor. But what most people do is they'll use a tool like Purge CSS, which is a tool for basically skimming through all your templates and destroying any selectors that don't match or that they can't find. So it just removes anything unused. And it works really well, but it's not like totally bulletproof. Like there's ways that
you're starting with everything and trying to eliminate things that are unused.
Yeah,
but that's
like it's not that it's that challenging of a problem. Like Purge CSS does it pretty well, and it does it well by not trying to be clever about it. It literally just like goes through your template. It does like a regex, breaks out everything based on white space, and just checks like, does this exist as a CSS selector? So even if you have like some hard-coded text that says "Hello World" with a dash in between it, and you have a class called Hello World, but you never use the Hello World class, well, it's still going to keep it because it found a string. It's not like intelligently parsing HTML and like looking at the class attribute or anything. So because it's like intentionally dumb, it actually means that you don't get a lot of like false positive removals that break your stuff. But you still have to author your markup in like a Purge CSS aware way.
Right.
Like you don't want to do like dynamic string concatenation and weird stuff, because you have to sort of know that, I want to be able to strip out unused CSS, or sometimes you have to whitelist stuff because you're using a JavaScript library where you don't control how the class names are generated. And so it's just like a whole class of problems that we have solutions for, but you have to think about them, and they like affect the way that you write stuff. Whereas if you're doing like a CSS and JS approach,
there's only one way to use a class ever. It's through the CSS function. So now you can whitelist everything, basically.
Well, you don't even have to think about it, because the only CSS that ever exists is the CSS that gets used.
It gets auto-generated.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
Nice.
I see. So it's not that you're not picking out the CSS classes that you need based on the function call. It's just generating the classes that you need.
Yeah. And I think some of these tools are smart enough too to like make sure that, like, try and be efficient about the fact that these two divs have 4 of the same CSS properties defined. We generated 2 unique classes for them or something, but maybe it makes sense for us to generate a third class and apply 2 different classes to each one of these now, so the CSS delivered is smaller. There's just like a lot of interesting optimizations that like happen there.
Yep.
So I probably still just would use Tailwind because it already exists, but I think it's interesting that like you could solve that same problem in like a little bit of a different way, and I think you're going to start seeing things like that start to happen, where you have these like more opinionated constraint systems that are like layers on top of these like low-level CSS and JS generation tools.
Do you see a future where no one's writing CSS? Like CSS is...
I don't think so, because like I don't see a future where people aren't writing server-rendered HTML. Like people are always going to do that,
right?
I think. So there'll always be a place for regular CSS.
Do you have like if you could snap your fingers, what you'd want to see in terms of workflows with in some of these areas. Like we've talked about, what would it look like to have kind of like a sketch in the browser where, when you start using something like Tailwind and you're like, I can build my whole application with 10 steps on a padding scale and 5 colors. What if I could have Sketch, and instead of me having an infinite color palette, I could just have those 5 colors.
Yeah.
When I drag the font size, it just clicks in between the 5 steps. And now I can just build my design very quickly in Sketch. And really dragging that scale is like toggling those functional classes, but I'm not worrying about maintaining any of that.
Yeah, there's actually, I know of a couple people that are making interesting progress in the space of like design tools that are kind of focused on designing in code, but giving you like an interface to do it, and having it work with like constrained design systems that way. So the one that I've been following most closely is Modulz, Modulz, America. And the thing that I think are interesting about these tools is they're not like Sketch in the sense you don't have like a rectangle tool where you like drag a rectangle. It's like you have like a div.
Oh, interesting.
You know what I mean? So you're still building like you have a layer list, but it feels more like the Chrome dev tools, like
you would put it in the flow kind of thing. Like you would add a div and it would snap in the flow instead of just an arbitrary.
You kind of like drop in a box and it knows that it's HTML and it's expecting you as like the designer to understand the medium that you're designing for. But then you have like that same sort of Sketch style sidebar on the right where your color palette, you pick a color from the color palette, you pick a font size from the font scale, you can add margin, and it is margin. It's not just like space between things like it is in Sketch.
Right.
It's margin or it's padding.
Right.
Because it's rendered as HTML. Like that's what the design tool is.
That's so cool.
It's pretty cool what people are doing there. I think there's another one called Compositor, which is sort of similar.
Adam's project.
Tachyon's guys work on that one.
Other Adam.
Which looks cool. So, I'm interested to see what people do with these kind of like design tools that that embrace the fact that your output is going to be HTML. Because there's so many design tools that try, like even Sketch, you can like right click, copy CSS or something. You know what I mean?
You're never going to use that.
No. And there's tools that try to generate HTML for you with like a WYSIWYG editor or something. And it's a noble effort, but it's never going to be as good as if the design tool just like embraces the fact that yes, you are actually designing HTML right now, and you just need to know that that's what you're designing, and the metaphors are all the same. Like finally, you can put a border on the top and not on all sides at once.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like no one is using lines to do things in on websites like you are in Sketch and stuff. So yeah, I don't know. It should be interesting. Like there's no like visual use the mouse to draw stuff. Like maybe you can use it to like drag stuff around and click stuff into like different layers, only really vertically though. You know what I mean? Because that's how HTML is generated. But everything is just done by like insert like this element, insert this element. Now kind of style it all up, and it can actually create like React components for you or whatever that are actually stay in sync, unlike when you design stuff in Sketch and you have like a design team that's like constantly battling to make sure that like what's actually on the website is like manually being synchronized with what people are doing in their design tools and stuff like that. So
do you feel like is any of that stuff really painful for you, or are you more just passively interested in it? Like, does that feel like a pain point for you that if that existed, you would be like really excited about using it?
I don't know. I think I'm pretty quick at designing in the browser as it is, but I bet you these tools would still be faster than that and could produce like the exact same outcome. Like there's something interesting to me about thinking, okay, I built this landing page the other day. Like what would that have been like if I had like an editor for building the landing page that actually produced the actual landing page, unlike Sketch, where a lot of time I feel like if I'm doing high fidelity work in a design tool, there's this part in the back of my brain that's like, this is disposable. Like
it's a waste of time because it's going to be.
This is not a deliverable. You know what I mean?
Right.
I'm still going to have to do all this work again, but Yeah.
Right, but then there's this thing where there's sometimes you go down that road and then you realize the design doesn't work and you change it in Sketch and you're like, I'm glad I didn't spend time coding that because it is faster in Sketch, or can be.
Yeah, certain things can be. For sure.
Certain things can be. So what's your workflow with Sketch? I mean, your stuff online is all really top-notch from a design perspective. So what's kind of your workflow? Like if you were to start a new project, what would it be? What would it look like?
So I'm not a super talented designer myself. I have a friend, Steve Shoger, who helps me a lot with design as well. So I can do design stuff, and I do sometimes use a design tool, but most of the time I do it directly in the browser, and it's a little bit slower and whatever. A lot of time what will happen is I'll get Steve to give me like an initial idea for something. He uses Sketch because he's not a front-end developer, so that's the tool that he's fast with. And he'll send me something, and then I'll just kind of build that and iterate on it in the browser. Like there's never a second draft that happens in Sketch. You know, at most it's kind of like figure out the bones,
right,
where it feels faster, and then build that, and then from then on, like all the work happens in HTML and CSS for my stuff, anyways.
Right. So like Tailwind CSS.com, was that?
Yeah, some of that was done in Sketch. But again, a lot of it changed once I got into HTML and I started resizing the browser and figuring out how, you know what I mean?
Right.
So yeah.
Nice.
What's next for Tailwind? Like, do you have any plans for future versions? Anything you want to do?
Well, I want to get to 1.0, and I don't really have a roadmap for that. It almost is fine as it is. I mean, there's no problems with it. So I could just tag 1.0 now, but I'm always afraid that as soon as I do that, I'm going to discover a breaking change I want to make. You know what I mean? So it's like paranoia.
It's only going to get harder.
Yeah, you wouldn't know anything about that.
I would not. I have a library that it's like, I don't even know how old it is now.
3 years.
3 years old. It's still used enough in the Ember community that it should be. Yeah. It should be like 3 or 4.0 right now.
Yeah, it feels like a big commitment to.
I think you just got to pull the trigger. Really, I mean, again, do as I say, not as I do.
Some things I know that I want to change. I kind of want to tweak the config file layout. Like me and Jonathan we struggled so much with the naming of like all the keys in the config file. So like things like border colors versus like, let me think of like another one. Like basically we had the really hard decision to make between like pluralizing or using singular for different things. So certain ones are singular and certain ones are plural based on, we just kind of decided, you know what, we're just going to choose the ones that like feel best for that thing. And then we added this section at the bottom of the config file where you could customize whether responsive, hover, focus, active, all those variants were generated for each one. And in that section, pluralization felt wrong for every single one. It felt like they should all be singular. So that's one of those situations where it's like, okay, now I know like the correct answer to this is everything should be singular. Even if it feels...
So like width.js. Like width would be the name of it instead of widths.
Yeah. Is it widths right now? Like,
I think it is.
Yeah.
So one thing that I actually did want to talk with you about, I'm glad that Ryan brought it up, is because we work on the integration story in Ember for Tailwind, Ember CLI Tailwind. And in Ember, everything is like an Ember add-on. It's like a special version of a module, basically, that knows how to hook into the Ember pipeline and do some different things. And so the way Ember CLI Tailwind presents Tailwind to the host app is it adds a Tailwind directory. And then it has like a config folder and a modules folder, and then like a components folder and a utilities folder. So you can go in and add like a component to the components folder, and it'll automatically be included into Tailwind processes. Yeah. And same with the utilities and everything, cool. Which makes it super easy to like define the utilities or components. And then, also you can customize the utilities right there because it has like, it'll be /tailwind/modules/widths.js, and then it'll have the default widths, and then you can just customize in JavaScript. The build will, your app will reload and you'll get the new classes that you can use. And right now it's all hard coded.
Yeah.
So like I just had to look at the names.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking if people are going to be building more tools on top of Tailwind, it might be nice to have an API to like crawl the names of the modules and get the default value, something like that.
Yeah.
Because right now, like if I were to upgrade, it would be like a change right there. And you know, we were talking about like the style guys, the same kind of thing, right? People are going to build
try
more
to standardize.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think really the names don't matter as much as like if you expose it in a way that other library authors can consume, then it's like I don't care if it's called /module/width or width.
Totally.
Width feels right to me in the way that we have it, because you're like, oh, just open up our colors. And so you just like command P colors.js and I'm going to see all my Tailwind colors.
So
right
colors will be that way. It'll be plural because it's not really a module anyways. It's just a variable that the modules use.
Right.
But I think everything else is going to go singular. But it'll be backwards compatible because we can just alias them at least to start, and then maybe it'll be a breaking change when 1.0 comes out.
Yep.
Other than that, I don't really have there's certain features people want to add in terms of new styles. Like people want CSS grid support, and I'm hesitant to do stuff that doesn't have good IE11 support. So even though CSS grid, technically there's a version of the spec that exists in IE11, it's completely useless. It shouldn't even be. Can I use is very deceiving when it comes to that. Yeah.
Interesting.
There's no prefix and it works. It's completely different.
Oh, interesting.
So many key features basic features, for example, with grid now, if you give something like display grid, you can just drop divs in it and they'll all be columns by default, sort of thing. Or you can do call auto or something. That doesn't exist in the IE11 version. There's no way to just have the number of columns, and it's not even just the width of the columns be defined automatically. Even the position of the columns can't be defined automatically. So if I have a 3-column CSS grid, I can't just do grid call and have it work. I have to do grid call 1, call 2, call 3, because it has to have the position of the columns has to be defined in the CSS. So it's just a useless version of the CSS grid spec. And IE11 still has enough usage that I don't feel comfortable. It's not that I don't feel comfortable adding features that are IE11 or that don't have IE11 support. It's that I'm not stoked about bloating the default CSS file size with stuff that people who have to build stuff that isn't an internal tool can't use. You know what I mean?
Yep. But you added a plugin system recently.
Yeah, so the plugin system is kind of designed to help ease that pain. And I think the development process that I want to adopt for stuff going forward is, unless it's very, very obvious how things should look, I'd like to develop new stuff as plugins and then have plugins sort of graduate to being included in core once they sort of stabilize on their own. Because people want transition support and stuff, and trying to come up with the names for that and what the default value should be. It sucks to have to version Tailwind when I'm iterating on that stuff, when I can just have that as a plugin that's just some crazy rapid development cycle where things are changing all the time. And then once it feels right, it's just that's the last version of it. It gets merged into Tailwind, and it's basically it becomes deprecated as a plugin or something. Right?
It's a great way to excuse me. It's a great way to signal to users what's experimental. That's awesome. That's
the way to go. Small core with a plugin system means that you are going to be able to finish Tailwind and let the community just go with it. Whereas the project I work on is it doesn't have that nice separation. But there's been some other projects in the Ember community, like the Ember CLI deploy. It's the same idea where the core is just defining a pipeline of deploy steps, and then there's all these plugins that do different things, upload to S3 and all this stuff, and then so the core work is done. It's been done. It just provides an interface. And even Ember itself is doing that now, where they for too long tried to get things perfect and get it into Ember, and it slowed down progress. And then with the add-ons, they're okay, now you can go crazy in add-on land, and then eventually we pull things in when they make sense. So I really think that's a lesson I've learned doing open source, and I think that's the right way to go for sure.
Yeah, and we could always keep things as external plugins too if we wanted to, even if they're technically core. One thing I really like about the way NPM does things is packages are sort of decoupled from repositories. You know what I mean? You can have one repository that hosts multiple packages that has a script that splits those off and publishes them to
Yeah, I don't have experience with that, but I know some people in Ember do that. Is that like Lerna?
You can do stuff like that. That makes some of that easier. But just like the general concept of like an npm package not being a GitHub.
I see.
repo.
So you could have in the Tailwind repo, could have like a root Tailwind, which is its own npm module, and then you could have other official.
Like Tailwind
extensions.
is already like that in some sense. Like the bundle of code that lives on npm server is not the same as the code that's on GitHub. So like we have dist builds for CDNs, for example, that aren't committed to the repository, but they're in the build for
I see.
npm. So you have like that flexibility, which is kind of nice. So we'll experiment with that and see where things go. I think like in terms of other future plans for Tailwind, there's not really a lot of stuff to do with like finishing the framework or anything like that. For me, I'm just looking for other interesting things to do kind of around Tailwind to sort of like enrich the ecosystem, you know? So I really like to, something that I always had plans for was to sort of treat Tailwind as like a low level sort of set of building blocks and still be able to provide like more opinionated frameworks like built on top of it almost. And then with the plugin system, that's become like a lot easier. So
something like a Bootstrap.
Yeah, so we could have like something that felt like Bootstrap in a lot of ways, where you wouldn't npm install Tailwind on your project. You'd like npm install Tailwind CSS admin theme or something, and it would have a bunch of plugins built into it, like button classes, stuff like that, that provide their own configuration for you to tweak. Instead of importing Tailwind's like config file, like your Tailwind config file would probably just look like module.exports equals require Tailwind CSS admin theme dot config. You know what I mean? And because the config comes with the package, and instead, like there's so much you can do there. The options are really limitless in terms of what a plugin can provide or what a package can provide on top of it. So it'd be interesting to just explore like how can we use Tailwind and its plugin system to provide kind of like solutions for people who can't really effectively use Tailwind on its own right away. Because I personally know tons of back-end developers who, like the ironic thing about Tailwind is like it lets you never write CSS ever again, really. Right. But like you have to be really good at CSS to use it still.
Right. You have to know what you want. I mean, there's a reason Bootstrap is as popular as it is. It's extremely easy to use. Yeah. The problem is it doesn't decompose into things in a proper way that lets you customize them, and so people just bolt on the specific overrides, which, as everyone knows, is crazy unmaintainable. So if you had something like a Bootstrap, but it decomposed in a way that you could override things,
and everything's configurable. Like good defaults. Yes, but unlike something like Bootstrap, where if I want to change something, like Bootstrap is all variables and stuff too. Like most of it is customizable, but there's no like official like here's the customization guide. It's a lot of like dig through the SAS source, find out what variables you're using, make sure that changing this isn't going to affect anything.
It's not designed.
You don't know if your change is going to look good. Like just because I can change a number from 10 to 20, I have no, I'm not a designer. So when you say starting out with like an admin theme that I can install, that really excites me.
Yeah. So I think that'll be like a cool thing to do, and I'm also looking forward to experimenting with that as like a way to help like sustain Tailwind development by making some of this stuff like paid add-ons and stuff. Like Bootstrap has paid themes and stuff too. Nice. So I can like work with designers who want to design more like opinionated based component sets and stuff for Tailwind. You could pay $50 or something.
That would be awesome
to get that pre-done for you. And
I love that.
Yeah. So
I love the idea of figuring out how to monetize the work too. Just again, so that what could you do if you were working full time on Tailwind? Like you could provide so much value to the community, and maybe other people could make a living or help make a living off.
Yeah, just create a community around it of interesting tools and stuff. So
maybe one more question, really quick, in this kind of area is. We've started using it more like now if we reach for Tailwind kind of for every project, it's so nice. It's these low level things. You can get it going. But let's say you did have this thing where you have an admin that is Tailwind,
Yeah.
and you're pulling that into a site. But then someone else has a dashboard, and that's their own custom Tailwind. They pull it into a site, and you start pulling these things in, and now, like the notion of how to share on a single app, Tailwind can let you prefix things, which is nice. But it also kind of it adds some noise.
I think you're going to have I don't think you'd be able to sort of take two themes or something.
Two Tailwinds into the same app.
You'd have some collisions to worry about, I guess.
Right.
If you're trying to do it in the same build process and everything like that. But I have seen people try and do two Tailwind builds in the same app, where maybe they have like a client or customer facing side of the app and then like an admin side of the app.
Yeah.
And they want to have like two separate CSS builds, or maybe like the branding is different for them, right? Like maybe just the design of the admin site is different because that makes it easier to use for people who are going to use that.
Right.
And you can totally run two Tailwind builds, but it's just a matter of knowing how to set up your build stuff to do that, because what you end up needing is two separate PostCSS plugin chains, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just a matter of like configuring Webpack with two entry points and two exit points with their own separate set of loaders and stuff. And I don't know enough about Webpack to do that from scratch myself, but
right.
You can totally set that up that way. So
right. I think some of the stuff around the CSS and JS where you could imagine that making it a bit more portable if you had a component or a page or part of a page that had its own stuff. It would be easier to share and not collide in a global way. So I think that'll be an interesting challenge for the future, though, just figuring out how to share. Because Tailwind is so general purpose, so it's going to be used in all sorts of environments.
Yeah.
But that's part of what makes it hard when you think about the sharing and avoiding collisions and stuff.
Uh-huh.
So.
Yeah, I mean, it would almost be interesting to try and build some CSS and JS stuff like into Tailwind in a sense, where there's almost like an API to get at the stuff like in between the config and the generated classes. You know what I mean? To get like the values that are output from like Tailwind's config stuff before it just flattens that into regular CSS.
Right.
And have like a way to hook into that.
Right.
Even like being able to use stuff like add apply in like the style section of a view component or something, which currently is not possible really, but it's something that I want to work on before 1.0, because like the way that Tailwind does that stuff is it basically looks at this current CSS tree that it sees, and if you try to add apply text center, well, it's going to walk through all the rules and be like, okay, where's text center? Okay, here's the rules for that. Okay, paste them in. But the way everyone has their build stuff set up is like PostCSS runs on that on its own. Then it runs on this CSS on its own. So if Tailwind's utilities are all over here, none of these blocks can see them, So I want to improve it a little bit so that we have like almost like a fallback map of rules where it can look in that tree to find a match, and if it doesn't, it can kind of look and see like, well, if Tailwind's utilities were available here, like would we be able to find it in that list?
Right.
Just kind of like an invisible sort of like phantom lookup table or something. And I think that would make a lot of different things easier that can't really be done right now, that we never really tried to optimize for anyways. But I'm starting to feel the pain of that a little bit as I work on some like view educational training stuff, kind of like what you guys are doing with the Ember stuff, where you want to use Tailwind to just quickly style up the example so that it looks good in the demo.
Yep.
But it's adding all this noise to the screencast because even though it's totally in a real app, I think that's the way to do it.
Right.
But in like a video where you just want people to be able to look at like this click handler, like it can just be like distracting. Like what here is like the stuff that they're trying to teach me, and what is just the stuff that's making it look the way it looks.
Absolutely. We were working on a video a few weeks ago where we had marked everything up with Tailwind, and we were like, okay, let's not show all this because it's too distracting for like the main lesson.
We pulled the top two divs out into a parent template just so they didn't show up in that part because they weren't important.
So for like the tutorials I've been working on, I'm making all these component classes that are just making me so sad. It's just like the exact opposite of the CSS I would ever write, and I almost feel bad that people are seeing it, because I don't want them to think that like.
Oh, that's how Adam uses Tailwind. I'm gonna go start writing all my
exactly.
profile bar number header item class or whatever.
Like user avatar, contact first name, contact last name, like.
Right. Well, this is where we got to get the class. I want to try that next. I'm convinced that would be a good solution. But cool, man. Well, that was great. Ton of awesome information, and we're really excited to see where Tailwind ends up in over the next year, and just follow your work. It's fun, kind of that this is like an area overlap. We're used to just I think Vue and Ember and React and all these communities are starting to. There's the shared lessons are starting to come up. They all were created for their own reasons, but now as the whole JavaScript community moves forward, we're running into the same problems, and so it's great to meet people from other communities and see how they're solving these similar problems. So
cool.
Thanks for coming on and chatting with us. And
my pleasure.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you want to plug?
Yeah. So if you want to check out Tailwind CSS, if you thought this conversation was interesting, tailwindcss.com. You can learn more about that there. I'm also working on, I'm about to release a course on advanced Vue component design. So if that sounds interesting to you, you can check out advancedvue.com. It covers a lot of stuff on sort of advanced component design patterns, building components that don't render any user interface stuff, how to use component composition to solve problems that you would normally solve in JavaScript and make the solutions more portable and reusable. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there. So if you're interested in checking that out, that's what I'm currently working on right now. So
nice. Yeah, I saw some of your articles on that, and again, it's really cool because that's some of the stuff that we focus on in our educational materials too. Getting past, like the purpose of things like Vue and Ember aren't just to make it easier to do what we did before. It's to be able to do things like make a fetch component. In Ember, it's called contextual components.
Yeah.
Lets you do these kinds of like renderless components, or a render prop in React, or the slots in Vue and all that stuff. So it's really neat, and I really like the way you explain it. So that'll be cool to see that when that comes out. So
thanks, man.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming on, and thanks to our listeners, and we'll see you next week.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you very much.